Up here, Canes.
Carolina Hurricanes.
Oh, Carolina
Ooh,
Hurricanes.
Next.
Okay.
Yep.
And your hat? I can't see what it says.
Bull City. So that's the nickname for Durham. Right.
Durham. Yes, I knew that one too.
So
Yeah,
it will
nice.
it will not surprise listeners to then speculate that you went to Duke.
No. Yep. Went to Duke. So whenever I wear the Hurricanes hoodie, I either wear my Hurricanes hat or rep Bull City. So yeah.
And where are you at right now?
I'm in Edmonton, Alberta, Canada.
And is this where you're from originally?
Nope, I'm from Southern California, actually. So in terms of hockey, since you mentioned the Hurricanes, they're like our home away from home team. So east side when we lived there for 5 years in North Carolina, but LA Kings fan, home. That's the main team. And yeah, so in a rival Edmonton Oilers up here, big rivals for the LA Kings, and it's good fun. It's good fun. So
are you a Dodgers fan also? Are you rooting for the Dodgers this weekend?
No,
not
I'm not. I don't care. Yeah, to be honest, like I wish yeah. So short answer, no, really, not a baseball. Have just NHL for me.
Well, thanks for listening, guys. We'll talk to you next time.
I mean, if I'd known you didn't like baseball when I opened your book,
it's not like it's just too many good things in this world, and that's just not one I could fit in.
Okay, so you're from
I'm not a baseball hater. Yeah.
You're from Southern California. You went to Duke. Emma the Free. I'm wondering, like, did you grow up in the church? Because the topic of your book is near and dear to a lot of Christians.
Yeah, so I grew up Jehovah's Witness, and I've mentioned this on a few different podcasts. So just in terms of, I don't know, feel like if someone's going to listen to this, they probably listen to my other ones or something, at least in terms of me, or they'll skip right over, who's this guy? And we'll just wait for your next episode. So I'm sure folks have already heard enough about that. But yeah, in short, grew up Jehovah's Witness. So they for all the differences between, in terms of doctrine and all that, they actually, like, you'll know the Bible pretty well in terms of just like content. Like they read a lot of the Bible. And so, yeah, I've just been into the Bible growing up, and then obviously I'm no longer Jehovah's Witness now, but yeah, that story's long and complicated, but I wound myself through because of my mom, who, yeah, so much backstory there as well, but ended up in like, go
ahead, give us the backstory stuff.
John MacArthur's vibe. We were next to the Master's Seminary in Santa Clarita, I believe it's in, which is like just 20 minutes or so out from where I grew up, and 20-30 minutes depending on certain traffic. But so I was in churches affiliated from pastors that went to Master's Seminary, and that was junior high and following. And then weirdly, like what I feel like they're all the ones who've changed. No, I'm just kidding. Like I feel like it's just taking the Bible seriously from that upbringing just led me to realize that it was a similar sort of experience of leaving Jehovah's Witnesses and talking with my family and elders, Jehovah's Witness elders there. It was a similar experience of realizing people are not as committed to the investigations they claim to be, because when push comes to the shove and you just can't unsee certain things, there's people, evangelical as well, seem to be less persuaded by what's actually there or not there in the Bible than they claim. Now, me personally, I'm not a biblicist either anymore in terms of hermeneutics and theological hermeneutics, but the irony is I think even if you were being a biblical, like, literalist, fundamentalist, I don't think you'd end up with a lot of the theology that gets passed and tagged as a Bible only based belief system. So, yep, that's why I'm knowing those things.
And how did you set upon sacrifice and atonement as a topic you wanted to focus on?
It was slow. Like, so my dissertation work is on Romans and Paul, and I've published articles on all kinds of like, I don't have a focus, and that's probably because of my ADHD and all that, or most definitely it is because of this. But that topic is always, the sacrifice atonement issue has been something I've been interested in all the way through all my pre-degrees and during all my degrees for this. And part of that was it was attending to the scarcity of actual sacrificial language in the New Testament. And that was surprising given how much attention a lot of theologies give to sacrificial metaphors of Jesus' death. And then observing that not all sacrifices had the same function. So what's going on there? Which sacrifices? And how can we tell if there's sacrifice being activated? But clearly Jesus' death is everywhere in the New Testament, right? So it was also kind of observing there's something going on here between Jesus' death having more significance, or the saving significance of Jesus' death exceeds sacrificial metaphors, because those are actually just one of many that are used in the New Testament to describe the saving significance of Jesus' death. And I use that phrase to get away from language that we talk about atonement theories or something like that. And that I think has contributed to a lot of confusion and just misunderstandings about how Jesus' death is a benefit for creation and for humans in particular, I guess. And so it's just it was just the kind of thing that we're all going to notice something different, given whatever our backstories, all kinds of stuff. But when you're reading the Bible over and over again for whatever reasons, not just pietistic, I'm doing my quiet times or whatever type reasons, but if you're just spending time in the Bible a lot, then certain things are going to stand out to different folks. And one of the things that stood out to me was all these discrepancies between the way I was either taught or just like kind of formed to think about through songs and sermons and all kinds of stuff. So taught formally and or just moving through evangelical churches. But the way we would talk about the saving significance of Jesus' death didn't actually seem to cohere with what I was then reading, and like what was being proclaimed as the gospel was this system, whether it's penal substitutionary atonement, and sometimes even not that, like some other, like justification by faith, let's say, and then you'd get some sort of penal substitutionary atonement or something like that within a framework of justification by faith. Either one, that's one of the big aha moments was me in undergrad studying Acts and organizing the speeches and summarizing them, and just realizing like, what if I preached this at a chapel in one of our and said, here's the gospel, and I said something like one of these speeches, they would say, you didn't preach the gospel. Where was this emphasis on Jesus dying instead of you? Where was this emphasis on the wrath of God? Where is this? Why didn't you talk about justification by faith? Why is it all about the resurrection? Like, why is it all about the resurrection and this, how the promises are being fulfilled and what promises those are and all that? And there's no like atonement theory. So that just really was like, well, what the heck then? So if we have a gospel that we then have to go read Acts and say the gospel's not there, that's pretty jarring. And then people try to like wiggle through it. I've read all this stuff about, well, it's there, and like when Paul saying goodbye to the Ephesian church, reference to blood. It's like, no, that's not. Like about that reference and stuff, and other ones. It's just So
this Jesus whom you killed, God raised him up. That's That's not really an atonement theory. No.
It's like
exactly reporting a fact. Yeah.
Just observations. That's where it comes down to. So all my little weird projects, I guess weird because I don't have like a line, a through line to all what I'm doing in terms of scholarship, but it just comes about by just observing, just kind of read and other, not just the Bible, but other primary texts too around that era, and just things that will stand out to different people. And that's the joy of scholarship, is other folks are seeing other things and just being able to connect dots that folks aren't maybe not connecting yet. It's really fun. Like right now I'm reading Andrew's, I forget the exact time or something along those lines. And one of our key bits there, Pillar, is just a cool observation that's been like observed elsewhere, but just how she's applying it in terms of like, there's no real contrast between old age, new age in Paul. It's the present evil age and in Christ, and what to take that seriously. And when there are like what scholars have called like New Age concepts, for instance, to see how Paul like actually works with those and all in a person, right? And it's just basic observations like that, though, can unlock like just a lot of things in that book. And it's like, well, I've kind of seen that. Like, it wasn't a surprise in terms of like never thought, but also it's just the way she's framing that observation. So it's just I love this is like, yeah, I just, you never know what you're gonna find. Just be surprised by spending time in the text, and things will pop out.
That's good. Yeah, I mean,
hang on. I have a question. So you brought up substitutionary atonement theory a little bit ago, and it's in the if for folks who go to Whippenstock's website, like substitutionary atonement, not bold letters, but it's in that first line. For listeners and those of us who maybe skipped atonement theory day in our time in seminary, can you help us understand why, when, how substitutionary atonement became so popular within the church, when, as you were saying, it doesn't really exist within the biblical canon?
Sure, with the caveat a little bit that like that's beyond my pay grade. I like to stay in my lanes now.
Sign up for the lecture on campus, and you can hear it.
No. Like, so you need someone else. You need someone else who's better versed in historical theology.
no. See, we're all preachers here, and so we just like to pretend we know a lot more than we do.
Yeah, I do stuff every Sunday. I have no idea what I'm talking about.
So just speak with authority, even if you're not sure.
Wave your hands around.
Like, I mean, I have to use those gestures. When it comes to a lot of, wait, did you want me to define penal substitutionary atonement, or more, I guess, or sorry, I lost it, or just like how kind of what it is now,
what it is now, and how how we got to where we're at now.
Gotcha. Yeah, well, I'll just skip the Anselm then, because I don't want to get wrapped up in some of the patristic aspects, but I'll just say that when a lot of people are finding substitution in various patristic writers, I think they are collapsing solidarity, participation, union, a kind of thick representation with substitution. So just leave that to the side. But when we get to Anselm, you get the what's known as the satisfaction theory of atonement. And in terms of Anselm himself, he actually, in very beginning of why God became human. Sorry, no, I told you I'm above my pay grade. That treatise, whatever the Latin is,
Cur Deus Homo.
Yeah. Thank you. There we go. In the beginning of that, and again, this was something that jumped out at me because I did my homework assignment whenever that was taught. I forget, it might have been both undergrad and master's, because I remember going through it a couple times. In the beginning, what Anselm lays out, whether someone else thought this or not, but it's a dialogue. So like, whether it's fictive or not, I don't know. But what Anselm denies, is what looks like penal substitutionary atonement, that Jesus is suffering, like an infliction by God, that what he's taking is a suffering, is a punishment. And Anselm's very explicit. I think it's paragraph 1.8. I could be slightly off, but I'm almost positive that's it, because the reference there, if you want to look up the primary source. And I found that, okay, so that's worthy of note, that what eventually becomes to be associated with penal substitutionary atonement, Anselm denies, yet Anselm becomes like the basis upon which this theology grows. So what Anselm says is the satisfaction, what Jesus satisfies in terms of God, is honor that humans ought to have given to God. That the feudal peasants did not give their feudal lord proper honor and respect through obedience. So Anselm kind of emphasizes a lot of the Philippians 2 vein, that obedience to the point of death, that Jesus' death is the epitome, the ultimate expression of his life of obedience throughout, and that he died simply because that obedience within a context of a bunch of people dishonoring God will be killed. And so Anselm, but something satisfies, God's honor is satisfied, that something that humans didn't provide, Jesus did in our place. So that basic framework then gets taken over in a more judicial register in Calvin. And Calvin is kind of the main one, I think, who presents what is satisfied is a penalty. What is satisfied is Jesus saving you from God. that what Jesus is experiencing is the wrath of God toward humanity, rather, if I might so boldly say again, rather than what the New Testament says, which is that Jesus is experiencing the injustice and wrath of humanity toward God and toward fellow humans. And it's not so much like, I do believe and confess Trinity, but it's not so much that Jesus is God, and that's why. It's that Jesus is human. And the way the what we call the Old Testament describes how human injustice is injustice towards God, or human generosity is generosity toward God. I think that connection there is key. But you have Psalm 2. I mean, there's a lot of psalms used to describe Jesus' death in the New Testament, and Paul talking about the powers who are crucifying Jesus. It's the rage, the insolent rage of the nations that he experienced. Yeah, so that's like whatever's going on with Jesus' death, it's an expression of what God will endure, will take into himself for the sake of, as Paul and John says, his love, right? So it expresses the love of God, not the wrath of God. And that totally undoes the framework that Calvin thought. Yeah, the Calvin thought up. And he kind of anchors this in Anselm. So it's like, well, it's kind of close enough to what he was doing. Let's derive that authority from him. And so that, I mean, and then from there, it's like all the traditions kind of influence from Calvin will inflect this in various ways. And some of I appreciate the sentiment of those who try to like soften what it sounds like, and they say, what penal substitutionary atonement sounds like. It sounds awful. They like Anselm says, that's not fitting. This is not fitting and appropriate for God. So like, don't even think in 1.8 there in the why God became human. So they try to like undefine penal substitution and turn it into something else, and just retain the phrase. And I'm just baffled by that on one level. On the other level, I get it, because I used to be a pastor at a church that, you would need to say, this is penal substitutionary atonement. You need to have that card, so to speak, ready to flash your bona fides that you can you uphold this view. And then when it comes to like scholarship and academia, there's so many institutions. Well, I shouldn't say so many. There's not a lot of jobs anyways. But in the scarcity of jobs, the percentage of them that I couldn't apply to, there's a lot, because it would require you to sign statements that explicitly say, this is what I think about Jesus' death. And there's often not even a capacity for anything else. Anything extra.
Yeah. That's what
Jesus' death means. It's a penal substitutionary sacrifice. And so on that level, I get why people have to find these funny ways of undefining penal substitutionary atonement to make it more palatable. But at the same time, it's no longer that. They're retaining the phrase for these institutional reasons. And I think that's a big problem, like just for broader, lack of a better term, the cultural aspect of and sociology of Christianity developing here in this era and over these generations. It's going to be a really weird, looking back at like we force people into saying weird things because otherwise they didn't have a job. And so I think that's why we get some of these like redefinitions, but it's just that these are redefinitions that are often, sometimes it's still like, that's just as bad. I don't care. Like he didn't fix anything. But sometimes it's like, well, that's no longer substitutionary then, or that's no longer penal and retributive then, like whatever it is that they're offering. So yeah, I find that like instructive just on the kind of meta level, I guess one level higher of, I think some of this is a problem because of the way we collect, like broadly speaking, we Christians have kind of hamstrung ourselves in certain places in the Protestant traditions.
That's why I asked about your interest in it, because lay people may not be aware that how you answer the question, why did Jesus die, is a question that, you then exempt yourself from a lot of Christian company who then will not see you as Orthodox, even though it's a question that the creeds make a point not to answer themselves.
I find, go ahead. I was just going to quote Anselm. I could do that or not do that.
Yeah, sure.
I finally found out because I was just trying to find it. So he says that it is book 1, chapter 8. So he says that God, the Father, did not treat that man, Jesus, as you apparently understand him to have done, nor did he hand over an innocent man to be killed in place of the guilty party, which is, there we go. I mean, he goes on even more, but there's a nice little nugget if you just keep reading. If anyone's interested, look that up. Look at chapter 8 there, book 1, and that's what I think. People are kind of into it sometimes. Like, I don't think Anselm's right either on his full thing, but at the same time, at least he's denying what ought to be denied, I think, and I think that's instructive.
You mentioned the power of just simple observations. Reading your book, I was reminded of a short little observation that Robert Jensen makes in a very small chapter on atonement that he writes, where he just makes them, he just notes that the cultic system that is present in the Old Testament is completely alien both to the Christian world we now inhabit, but also to the Jewish world as Jews inhabit it. And that was a way of reminding me that we have a whole lot of very precise atonement theology based on an understanding of a world that is no longer. And there's not a lot of humility that goes along with that distance of time and culture. And I was reminded of that because you do spend a lot of time in your book, Lamb of the Free, going through how to understand these sacrifices in the Old Testament. So I'm wondering if you could just, spend a few moments just kind of helping people understand in broad strokes what these sacrifices are and are not.
So I think, let me see if I can do it. Now this is, I've done a few interviews, and so
we're the best.
I don't know if I'm getting better or worse, to be honest. But let me try to be as brief as possible. Which, knowing me, I'm just talking to myself here to give myself some inner accountability. So who knows what this is going to end up like? But let me try to be as brief as possible, then, as I know how to be, and then you can ask some follow-up questions. So I'd say some of the key observations I want folks to know, or maybe be curious about, to then go read it in depth, is there's both atoning and non-atoning sacrifices. So that's like one of the basic observations there. And so just knowing that, I think should then, then which ones are applied to Jesus, where and when, and how would you know? All right. So the other one is the other basic kind of point. Easy to summarize all these, but harder to, that's why the book details it out. So I always just feel weird saying stuff and not proving it. But the other thing is that death has no ritual significance in the sacrifice. It can't, for cultic reasons. You can't bring death into sacred space. So it's reconfigured around life and the presentation of life. And the way, it might not make sense to us as much of well, you're still killing an animal, so what are you doing? And that's just, hey, they inhabited a different sort of framework than we do, but we could tell from what they're writing and talking about how they were construing this. And so who are we to then say, nah, we're gonna, you don't know what you're talking about, or whatever. Let them present this how they're presenting. And the priestly writers are, they seem to be the ones who, if they didn't write Genesis 1, that creation account, they at least adore it and preserved it, because this whole, humans aren't even supposed to be eating meat, right? Even though there's a concession after the flood, it's still very much this isn't right, because there is a death there, right? So then, but sacrifice is also very obviously a biological death is occurring. And the way they kind of make the problem worse in order to reconceptualize the problem. So one of the points about this death, that sacrifice isn't about death, is not just that it's given no ritual significance. Nothing happens. All the activity happens after the slaughter, and how you're presenting the blood on very specific sancta in particular actions. It's not just blood. It's are you dabbing it? Are you sprinkling it? Are you dashing it? Are you pouring it? And on which part of which object? So all this stuff matters, and it's all the things after the killing of the animal, and what the priest does with it. So the priest isn't usually the one who's slaughtering it. So there's that, but then there's also the fact that they say if you eat meat, this is Leviticus 17. If you eat meat that could be sacrificed, and it's not a sacrifice, then it counts as murder. It counts as shedding blood, because they that's in there. It's like that's a murder, even if it's for food. So sacrifice, if it becomes it becomes a non-killing. It becomes a sacrifice. It becomes a gift, which is then about the presentation of life in Leviticus 17, and that's the only way to mitigate. There's also, you can eat clean game, so you can't sacrifice it, but then you go through a similar sort of handling of the blood after the slaughter, so that it kind of, you're returning it. It's like you're ritually kind of undoing the taking of the life by putting the life back where it belongs in a ritual sense. Again, it might not make sense to us, but in their mind, this now makes it no longer bloodshed, no longer a killing, which means that when they think what they're offering in a sacrifice isn't a killing, isn't a shedding of blood, because for them, that's the problem, right? So they need ways of kind of, this animal's dying and we're eating its meat sometimes, but they need a way for that not to be death, not to be shedding blood and blood guilt. And that sounds so weird to Christians in terms of sacrifice, because we think the whole point is blood, like in terms of like a death. And for them, it was just the opposite of what was going on in sacrifice. And then Deuteronomy, you can't always, once they're in the land and it's like far away, and it's like, okay, we get it. You might not be able to actually do the sacrifice. So do what you would do with a deer, but still you have to handle it this way. Otherwise it becomes you're guilty of shedding blood. And so not only is it not about death, so that was the second point, right? There's two different kinds of sacrifices. It's not about death, and there's a couple reasons why I think that. The other thing is not substitutionary. It's not that this animal is dying for you, because it's not a substitutionary death, because whenever a sin, and not all sins, but whenever a sin requires either cutting off or being capital punishment, subject to capital punishment, there's no sacrifice that could remedy that. And if they thought of sacrifice in terms of this thing is dying instead of you, and you're like, yay, let that thing die, not me, then the one thing that you would see is, look, I mean, maybe not one animal, like sacrifice 10 of them or whatever, I don't know, but like, if the logic was never, this thing is dying instead of you, because any way you would ever substantiate that is all either contradicted or just missing, right? So from the evidence, so it's like, that just can't be how they were thinking of it. Yeah. So that's three. The fourth that's important is distinguishing between those. How would you distinguish between the atoning, non-atoning sacrifices? And has to do with whether or not the offerer eats of it. If they partake and eat of the sacrifice, has nothing to do with sins or atonement. So, yeah. Fifth point, Old Testament. Fifth point would be, I should probably have numbered these myself. I'm trying to go by recall here. So I don't even, I might be missing things in my own book. The fifth one I would say is that now I lost that thought. Yes. Okay. Fifth, we'll go when you're eating it, non-atoning. Well, now let's talk about what the heck is atoned, right? So this is the other thing. What is the action upon what we translate as atonement? What does that happen to? Most people assume it happens to the person, to the sinner, to the offerer, but it doesn't. There's direct objects in Hebrew. You mark. So I hit the ball to Jason. I didn't hit Jason. Jason be the indirect object. The verb hit. The direct object of that is the ball. And so when you're looking at verbs like, so kippur in Hebrew, what is the thing? What is the direct object? What receives that action? And it's always sacred space. So sancta is what I like for the plurals. It's either objects within or in the tabernacle, sanctuary, temple, whichever. All the the outer courtyard or the inner holy place or the most holy place, depending on the time and the type of sacrifice. That's another big thing. If and when there is atonement being activated in the New Testament, it's not about atoning human beings. It's about atoning sacred space. So then the question is which sacred space and where and why and those kinds of things. But humans, I guess this is not really about sacrifice, but just kind of like related in terms of what I deal with in the Old Testament chapters. There is a purification of humans, both for ritual impurities and what we call moral impurities. And the distinction between those two are like moral impurities have no ritual remedy. Ritual impurities are typically things associated with our human finitude, either beginnings or endings, so childbirth and things associated with that. So that's why any like emissions of semen, menstrual cycle, those things that deal with procreation are ritual impurity. But like excrement, urine, those won't make you ritually impure. If you get a cut farming or whatever, that blood doesn't make you impure. They're just abnormal genital discharges or sexual activity, scale disease that makes you look kind of like you're the Walking Dead, as Matthew Thiessen says.
What about kidney stones? Todd's suffering kidney stones right now.
That's just an ailment. That's just your human. That's just your weakness and frailty.
Okay.
You know. So, yeah. There's particular things there. Moral impurities are sins that don't have. They're those sins that don't have the sacrificial remedy, but so there's certain sins that contaminate the sacred space, the sanctuary, and then there's other ones that contaminate the person and the land, and that would make you morally impure. And these are sins of murder, of sexual immorality, and idolatry conceived. All three of those are the main categories detailed in Leviticus 17.
Mm-hmm.
Lost my thought again there. Oh, moral impurities, ritual impurities. So there is a cleansing of the person, right? When it's ritual impurities, so nothing to do with sins, those go away through washing, a baptism, an immersion into the mikveh, and usually the passing of some length of time. It could be like the sun down for some cases, or a week, depending on, there's various details, but it's some mixture of water washing and time. Now, the prophets talk about the cleansing, because moral impurity has no sacrificial or ritual remedy. The prophets speak about that cleansing of the person that needs to happen from those grave sins, we'll call them, because they lead to death. And there's no substitutionary death sacrifice, back to those other points. But the way the prophets talk about the moral purification isn't through a sacrifice, but through a divine water washing in the spirit. So it makes an analogy to the ritual purification system when it's talking about moral impurity. So I don't want to, in just the summary, like what I mean by there's atonement doesn't affect people, but it's on sancta. It's not to say that people don't have a cleansing that they undergo or need, right? I'm sure some folks may be listening like, well, what about these, texts talk about us being cleansed or whatever. Yeah, you're right. But you're not cleansed by a sacrifice, and they wouldn't be thinking that all of a sudden. That's our fault for conflating certain notions like way after the fact and saying, oh, this must have happened because it's a sacrifice. No, it happens because there's one historical event that is not obviously a sacrifice. There's no altar. He's a political execution by Rome, hanging out there outside the city in shame. And they're making meaning of that event. I'm trying to explain its significance through a variety of means. And one of those means is by relating it to Israel's sacrificial system and moral purification system. But because it's that singular event of the death of Jesus, doesn't mean that everything else then collapses into each other. Like they're making distinct points as they relate Jesus, the significance of Jesus' death to these various things. So when it's about our purification in the New Testament, it's just like what the prophet said. It's through our washing of the Spirit, and it's through our baptism, and it's baptism though into the event of Jesus' death, co-crucifixion, co-suffering. And because blood is a liquid of sorts, it can be analogized as it is to water and to oil, like ordination oil, as well as the sacrificial blood, but it just isn't inherently sacrificial blood. And then you would ask which one, atoning, non-atoning, just because it mentions our blood, Jesus' blood or something like that. Just mean his violent death has brought about these effects that you can understand if you understand Israel's system, or whatever aspect's being activated. I hope that was a summary, but I hope there is a purification that happens to humans, but it is consistent with what you were led to expect. Reading the prophets, that this is going to be a washing, and so we can be immersed in Jesus' death and I think more than just a metaphorical way for Paul. It's actually active through the Spirit of Jesus actually being in us and binding us to Christ and to his death, and that purifies us. But it's not. It's a union with his his, as Hebrews says, his indestructible life. It's that purifying agent. It's not he died instead of you, because the whole point is that you're going to then be right there with him, or already are, and you just need to realize it.
So Todd, having recently celebrated your 7th birthday, you've been working with these texts longer than we have, and so I'm wondering what thoughts you have.
Sorry,
I'm not 75.
Todd, I'm sorry. I'm really sorry.
For the past probably 20 years, probably been trying to consider these in more broad terms. So this actually is helpful. What I mean by that is Scott McKnight wrote a little book some years ago called The Community Called Atonement, attempting to really kind of, say that when we're talking about atonement, there are a lot of things getting done, and here are some metaphors and pictures. I would wonder what he would say along these lines, because I think to Andrew's point earlier, many have tried to shoehorn a particular view of penal substitution into a more broad way to describe all that goes on in the death of Jesus. What this made me think of, and I have not read Andrew's book, but I did catch a line in the introduction that I thought was worth kind of raising along those lines, is that introduction, you want to be upfront about the deeper reason underneath your inquiry, you say. And here's the line: my aim is ultimately to showcase the liberating message of the gospel as an act of resistance to other notions of freedom on offer in the world as represented in the U.S. national anthem. I don't want to pigeonhole you into that particular thing, but what you've described opens up a lot of ways to think about a different view of freedom wrought by your work. And so, to take a long way to answer Jason's question, I'm left to think that what you offer is a little bit of freedom from a particular vision that doesn't open up people to the breadth of what God does in us by his Spirit. And that what you have described in going through your litany of 5 or 6 things to look at, there seem to be a lot of ways that would liberate those who may have heard that shoehorned message. They might find a lot more freedom than they ever thought they had. I wonder if that was a name.
Yeah, because in that, as part of that section, you do connect penal substitution with like mass incarceration and things of that sort. This view of this transaction with God has implications in how we understand our lives and order things.
So I mean, that I hope I succeeded that, Todd. When you finish the whole thing, I hope that I delivered on that. But yeah, Hannah Bowman. If I think the article might be open access. I sorry if I'm wrong, but if you look up Hannah Bowman and mass incarceration, hopefully any audience, whoever, stumble upon her article. I encourage y'all to read it, especially when it comes to those like kind of political, social implications of all this and what so I wanted to flag that in the beginning to be like, like this is a nerdy historical classic biblical studies study. So if you're not the kind of person that usually reads those kind of books, then I don't know if you'll like it or like if it'll be an easy read or exciting or any of those things. But at the same time, maybe I can someone might be like willing to read a biblical studies book to be grounded and have that like basis to be able to discuss something that maybe they're more animate about and passionate about, in terms of like how these theologies play out in a actual ways in practice and have over time, and just how that context, like, so if you want to be able to adequately navigate that context, it's not so much, I don't like, it's which came first, chicken or the egg. It's not so much like this theology drives those practices, like it comes that way, or if it's how do we justify these kinds of practices we want to implement? Well, if we think of it, the God's justice this way, or, like however that kind of always just kind of mutually happens, that relationship of, is this a post hoc, justification of something? However way it works, it doesn't really matter at this point, because they are being linked and related in people's minds and in sermons about what justice demands, so to speak, and therefore if God is just, what all this is. And so we come ready made with, if Jesus is saving us and if God is just, because we already have defined for ourselves what justice must entail, then we've already know how Jesus' death has to be saving if it fits that definition of justice. And that's just a little bit, or a lot of it, backwards if we mean what we say about Jesus being the revelation of God, or just what Paul says, like, do we believe these words? That's why I said some of these topics that I have now as disagreements with either my Jehovah's Witness background and or mainly my evangelical background. Some of the disagreements I think are just over, y'all are being dishonest with what the words actually say in these texts. Even if now I also, like I said, I don't want to be mistaken as someone who's only ever just like, biblical literalism or something and foundationalism, but that's a topic for another time. But
well, even, I mean, you
if I
mentioned,
was, it's like, we need to get rid of this because it's just not reflective of the actual words on the page, as Howard Watts would say, the way the words run, and the revelation that Paul proclaimed. Well, all over the places have Paul in my mind. Teaching a class on Paul right now, his letters, but in Romans, this is the revelation of God's justice. And he's very clear. This is not a justice of the world. This is not a wisdom of the world. This is a justice. He justifies the ungodly. Like, what is that? What is it? That's no. And then in chapter 5, while we are enemies, while we are sinners, while we are helpless, while we are ungodly, God demonstrates his love. And this is his God's love is in not leaving us to our enslavement to death, not leaving us to our captivity to sin, and unwilling to leave us in the abyss of just the consequences of turning away from the living God. And that, for Paul, that's what the gospel reveals. The gospel is revealing God's justice. Now, we know what justice is, and now you can see that this story coheres with what you already thought justice was. This story reveals to us what actual divine justice is, and that is in making us the creatures, the just image bearing of Christ-like creatures that God has always intended to create from the beginning. As Ephesians says, we were created in Christ Jesus. We were created with reference to this one, and this is what justice looks like as it comes and embraces a broken and enslaved world. And to be united with that life, then, is to be made just, to be made someone who can, as Paul says, share in the sufferings of Christ, and we might share and participate in the glory of his resurrection. So if Jesus' resurrection isn't substitutionary, as I say there, and neither is his death, like, as goes our relationship to Jesus' death is how we relate to his resurrection. And anyway, so like, it's like the story of Jesus has to do something to our notions. Otherwise, he's just like I don't know, like, you turn Jesus into something that confirms an abstraction that we already had already. That, and he just kind of like, okay, yeah, we got our theory of truth, we got our criteria of what this would mean, and then, oh look, this coheres with it, rather than being something that's actually the apocalyptic unveiling that the apocalypse say that it is.
Yeah. That's good. So Todd and I were just recently at a conference where Chris Green was making the argument. He was wanting to contrast like Noah's Ark ARK with Noah's Ark ARC, and he was making the point that we don't read these passages in these stories all the way to the end, and that we're just bad readers of Scripture. And I think this is true too. That like something like a word like atonement or justification are ways that we talk about the story of Jesus, but instead in the church they've become things to be believed, and it's I think we do a real disservice to people.
Yeah, for sure. And it's, I'm hoping, like, for you said you're, it's pastors and preachers, like, I think I'm hoping primarily, like, I want to make a contribution to scholarship and kind of like, have the receipts, as they say, as the kids say these days. Actually, it's probably the kids don't say that these days. It's probably just geriatric millennials that still think we're young. But yeah, like to have those receipts there. But like, I really think, like, Todd, you're saying, like, to have freedom, like to to learn to proclaim the freedom in Christ that is just overwhelming. And it could be this particularly overwhelming when you've been nurtured and told that who God is something other than the one revealed, Jesus. God is like Jesus. And that if you take that and say that what Jesus is revealing is God's wrath toward humanity, then you've not only just failed to read the way John says what's being revealed there, but so you're just wrong on like an exegetical level. But because this is what it is about God, well, then you're proclaiming totally different character of God.
Yeah, I think it's
so that's a big deal. But I also don't want to kind of it is important, but at the same time, hey, God had me when I was Jehovah's Witness. I'm no longer of like, oh, you have to believe these right things and then you are saved or whatever. It's like I was just already drawn and kind of dragged along, I guess. Like I had some fun and do still along this journey, but sometimes I just feel like I'm being shoved in various directions. And just saying, all right, I guess we'll go here, whether that's theologically or geographically. Now I'm all the way up north, and either way, but my views of God have changed. At the same time, I know this to be the one God I've always known. So I also, as much as it's important, and it's serious to not mischaracterize God, at the same time, I don't want others to be discouraged or have this sense of if I don't anxiously then go find out all the true things that I'm somehow not in communion with the creator and maker and reconciler of all things. Like, no, you are.
I think that's
you are known by God. It's not like and yes, it will be a lot better. I think you feel a lot more free when you gain this clarity. But it's not as if you are lacking in connection and union with God, because that's also then to go like the revelation is it's not what could be. This is just Colossians, what is it, 1:27? The hope is Christ in you, the hope of glory. It's not for the possibility that you might hope that Christ could maybe be in you, and then you have the hope of glory. Right? The mystery is Christ in you already. This is what he's proclaiming as just what is reality. We are in the world in which God loves, and which what God has created and will preserve, will bring to its completion. So yeah, Colossians 1:27, right? To make known the riches of his glory, the mystery among the nations, which is Christ in you. So among the they don't even know. They're just being hit with this. Like, hey, did you know this is what is real about life? So it's not like until you get all the true things, then maybe this will happen. And this is why when they're getting it drastically wrong in various churches, for instance, the Galatians, he says, all right, I'll be at labor again, so that Christ is birth, but he's already there. We just need to do some, there's no gosh, what's the right phrase? I don't even know let me just try to say it another way, just to restate the point. Like we need to rest assured that as much and as fun and as important and significant it is to have our minds and perception renewed, to be able to rightly see this. It's like, Paul, I want you to know this. I want the eyes of your heart to be enlightened. You understand the depths of God's love, with, etc. But it's already there, whether you know it or not. Does that make sense? And yes, it's important to know, and that will change your existence in these mortal bodies as we experience them going forward. But it doesn't change God's knowledge and grasp and hold and security of us. So I hope that's a bit.
Yeah, no, and I think it's really helpful, because a lot of the policing around atonement theology, I think, reveals an anxiety about protecting God that doesn't. It's really just, it doesn't really make any sense if God is who Scripture says he is. But Andrew, so your book is Lamb of the Free, Recovering the Varied Sacrificial Understandings of Jesus' Death. Yeah. So, thank you for your time, and thank you for the book.
Thank you.
Oh, thanks for having me on. Good conversation. I hope it's fun for me, at least. So.
Likewise. So what classes are you teaching right now? One on Paul?